Brilliant. I can see people coming in. Thank you. I think that's stabilized with people coming in. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. The event tonight is called Land Use Conversations, A Glenken's Future. And so delighted to see so many people turn up tonight. We're always worried about doing these events during the summer because of long sunny evenings and things. So it's a real testament to the importance of this topic, really, the number of people we've got signed up. So thanks so much for coming along tonight. We've got an hour and a half session here, and I'm hoping it'll be really interesting to give a local, regional, national, and possibly even international perspective on land use and how Galloway or the Glenkens fits into the bigger picture. With the event, there's 5 or 6 different stages to tonight. Really, there's a slightly more formal first half and then an opener and looser second half. So first off, starting with me setting the scene, which is happening right now. This is happening right now. And then we're going to hand over, we've got Andy Tharm to talk about regional land use partnership. What does this mean and how could this play a part in the land use debate? And then why is land use not just science and figures and numbers, an artist's take on land use and how art can help us interpret this question of land use change. And then delighted to have Andrew Thinn, the chair of Scottish Land Commission, joining us to give a snapshot on the national picture and what does Scottish Land Commission do and how can that play a part in land use. And then delighted to have Ed Forrest, from Galloway in Southern Ayrshire UNESCO Biosphere, which obviously is an amazing local designation that we have in southwest of Scotland here, with a vision for sustainable land use and how it can draw together the national and regional picture that we've had. And then we'll open it up for questions there. So we have the facility actually to have people talking after then. So any attendees could talk or you could put your questions in the chat. Either way, it'll be seamlessly chaired by myself and I'll try and get around all the questions before 8:30. I can't miss this opportunity to mention the Galloway Glens scheme. So who I am, my name is McNab Laurie, working on the Galloway Glens scheme. It's a 5-year National Lottery Heritage funded scheme here in southwest Scotland, running from Carlsfairn down the River Valley to Castle Douglas and Kirkcudbright. You've only got 1 year left and running till September next year. And the reason we're interested in events like this is because we've got 6 aims, all of which tie into supporting employment in the area, encouraging better understanding of our heritage. But each one of these aims have a land use angle, because if we're supporting employment, encouraging people to stay in southwest Scotland, that immediately leads to the question of what jobs will people be doing, what jobs will there be, and how does that tie to the land use question. So while our headline is connecting people to our heritage, there's absolutely a contemporary land use angle to that. And we're looking to do events like this and anything else that we can do to try and provoke discussion and try and maybe see both sides of the argument and encourage discussion on this question of changing land use, particularly here in southwest Scotland. And I just wanted to quick mention someone locally will have received the Glenkens Gazette last time, had actual focus on land use, and the Galloway Glens was able to pay for that to be Royal Mail delivered to doors, just to try and encourage discussion along those lines. And if you haven't seen that yet, with us seamlessly, I'm sure one of the other presenters will be able to put the link into the chat box, or I will try and do it in a quiet minute, because there's a good few pages. There's got everything in there right from the farming through to forestry, through to different designations and things, and talking about land use in the Glenkens. So really, this is a bit of a development of that, really. So, Andy, the question here is whether I have a go at introducing you to the crowd, or whether you're able to introduce yourself. I think it'd benefit for everybody concerned if you introduce yourself properly, Andy. So if you're happy to start sharing your screen, Andy, and maybe just give us a wee snapshot of maybe just brief background and then the role that you find yourself in today, and particularly with regional land use partnership, that'd be very good.
Super. Thanks, McNab, and good evening to everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to come along and be involved in this land use conversation tonight. I'm hoping that you can see my screen. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, so by way of brief introduction, I'm Andy Tharm. I'm the Natural Resources Strategy Manager at South West Scotland Enterprise at SOCI. And I've recently moved across from Scottish Borders Council, where I worked for many years as the Ecology Officer. And I'd worked on things like the earlier land use strategy pilot, amongst other things there. So I'll give you some background to the regional land use partnership pilots, and also an update as to where we've got to with the current South of Scotland pilot. Okay. There we go. Yeah, so in terms of background, in terms of where the pilots have arisen from, they've come from the National Land Use Strategy, which is set out the government's ambition for sustainable land use and identifies a number of platforms for change for achieving that, which includes regional land use partnerships and also the national planning framework in particular. So those platforms for change are to help achieve the government's ambition for net zero 2045 through a just transition, and also to address the twin emergency of biodiversity loss as well. So it's very much focused on climate change objectives and addressing biodiversity loss. And Scottish Land Commission provided advice to Scottish Government in terms of the establishment of those partnerships and what might be required, and what the functions of those partnerships might be. And I was delighted to see Andrew Thinn is here from Scottish Land Commission. So that was recorded back in November 2020. The government looked for expressions of interest for pilots to participate in the programme. And in the south of Scotland, we were successful. The two local authorities and the enterprise agency as core partners to develop a regional land use partnership in the region. The others being across Scotland. There's 5 pilots in total. There's one in Aberdeenshire, one in Highland Council area, and then there's the 2 national parks as well. So we're working to a government proposal. There's a project brief, if you like, for all 5 pilots that we're working to. So there's 2 key elements to it. That's to establish a partnership structure to enable collaborative decision making involving a broad range of stakeholders, which can be really broken down into like 3 main sectors, if you like, the statutory agencies, the public bodies, the land use sector, which is a very broad term for land managers, landowners, all those involved in land use, be that businesses in the supply chain, environmentally NGOs, a whole range of interests, and particularly importantly, communities as well as key stakeholders. And that partnership is then to develop a regional land use framework, which will take the form of a spatial plan and using what's described as a natural capital approach. And I'll come on to provide some an example of what that actually means, to help us identify and agree upon, if it's possible, our priorities for land use change, and to support those objectives to reach net zero with a focus really on climate change objectives, and also to address biodiversity loss, and ultimately to help us signpost funding opportunities. So they are pilot projects. They don't have a role in targeting funding at this stage, but they are pilot projects, but we can help signpost funding. So we've produced this graphic under the South of Scotland pilot to help us to set out what our programme is and how we're going to achieve this through a natural capital approach, working with key stakeholders, hopefully such as yourselves, across our entire region. So as I've described, we need to address the twin emergencies, which develop a framework through partnership and adopt this natural capital approach. So we're describing that as in terms of considering the sustainable use of our natural assets to provide benefits, ecosystem services, if you will, to society. So using this wheel to help describe this, if we consider the land across our region, from Stranraer across to Eyemouth, and the natural capital that provides, so it's fundamentally based on the interrelationship between the physical and the biological and the functioning of ecosystems. So the land can be a pristine blanket bog, functioning as a pristine ecosystem, but also at the other end of the spectrum, it can be an intensively managed arable field. They're all ecosystems. They all are all natural capital, and they all provide a range of benefits to society. So we ask a lot of our land. We can consider the range of services that it does deliver to us. So there's productive services in terms of agriculture, obviously food production, sustainable timber supply, commercial forestry, and also critically in terms of energy as well, renewable energy in particular. So we need sustainable production from our land. There are what we describe as regulating services. So in terms of things like flood protection, sequestration of carbon, elements like this, and the supply of pure water and the control of water quality as well. And there's a range of cultural services. So in terms of our access and tourism opportunities, the cultural heritage, and here in the south of Scotland we have a rich cultural landscapes created over time through the management of mankind, if you will. And this is all underpinned and supported by biodiversity. So there's a whole range of stakeholders who have an interest and an involvement in this. And as I mentioned, in sort of three broad groups, there's communities, essentially communities, the land managers and landowners and those involved in the land use sector, and the statutory bodies. So that the process is to try and achieve through a collaborative thinking and discussions to say, well, look, we're asking a lot from our land. What's the balanced approach to this? Can we make optimal use of the land? What are we currently doing? Can we do things in a better way? And it's to provide that forum to enable those discussions to help us develop that framework for priorities for land use across our region. So in terms of our programme, we've had an initial phase of stakeholder engagement, and now we're moving into the phase of developing the framework, so a much more detailed phase of engagement. And the end of the pilots will be at the end of 2023, when we're to have published a regional land use framework, and also to have reported back on the process that we've undertaken during the pilots. So some key sort of quick headlines from the initial stakeholder engagement we've undertaken from the turn of the year through to the spring. Just some headlines. We're not saying this is in any rank order of significance, but biodiversity loss has been flagged up by stakeholders as a key land use issue in terms of commercial forestry expansion, agricultural intensification, and also the lack of diversity in agriculture. And also notably, there's a perception that there's limited community involvement in those decisions around land use. But equally importantly, we wanted to explore with stakeholders, and we'll continue to do so in the next phase in more detail. Well, what are the opportunities that may arise from land use change? If there are issues, how can we help address them? How can we work together to provide solutions to that? So, for example, in terms of biodiversity loss, there are opportunities through regenerative agriculture and with commercial forestry expansion. Are we maximising those opportunities for employment locally? And also, can we provide a better balance of woodlands, for example, with more native woodland being created as well? So there's a whole range of opportunities that are going to arise through this land use change, and we would like to explore with the communities across the region, stakeholders across the region, as to how can we develop this and maximise those opportunities to work for the south of Scotland. So what are we going to do next? Well, as I mentioned, we want to go out in a more intensive phase of stakeholder management, stakeholder engagement. We've got a big geographic area to cover. It's over 11,000 square kilometres, and there's obviously a very diverse range of land uses and landscapes across our region, from the Galloway Hills and the fertile coastal plain of Dumfries and Galloway, through the southern upland valleys like here in the Ettrick Valley, and across to the prime agricultural land on the Merse in Berwickshire over in the east. So we need to get out there, we need to speak to communities, we need to work across the sectors and work together collaboratively to explore those issues around land use change through the lens of climate change and biodiversity loss, and hopefully work together to identify some key priorities and piece that together in a regional land use framework. So just briefly to finish off, to say, well, what might that framework look like? As I've said, it's an indicative spatial plan, we think, at this stage. So it's likely to be in that time frame of 18 months, a high level strategy. So we've got some working examples. I mentioned the earlier land use strategy pilot I worked on in the Borders. I also helped develop the Scottish Borders woodland strategy, which includes an indicative forestry strategy. So some kind of examples to give us a flavour of where we may end up, to set out those priority of actions. And it will be its first iteration. It will develop in detail over time. We hope this is just the first step towards it. I would say that it's not going to be the answer to everything, certainly in its first version, but we'll take some strides forward to help tackle some of the problems. And as I've mentioned, I think the process and the lessons we can learn from that are as important as the product at the end of this pilot project. So thank you very much. And if you'd like to get in touch, then we have a web address to contact me, and we will provide an update through a web page on SOCI's website, and we'll be posting some of the findings from the first phase of consultations soon, but we're slightly snagged with our websites being updated at the minute. So as soon as that's resolved, we'll get that information out there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andy, for giving us a snapshot of regional land use partnerships. A couple of questions have come in, and I'll pick up with those in a second, but I can just outrageously use my position as chair to jump in with a question first of all. Do you see this as a decision-making opportunity in the fullness of time, or is this something that advises upwards and downwards, or is this somewhere where decisions will be made regarding land use?
Well, I mean, obviously at this stage, the pilots, so we're testing approaches and reporting back to government ultimately, and it'll be their decision as to what function they may have in the future. We think here in the south of Scotland, the support here with the core partners, the local authorities and SOCI itself, to say, well, we can see the value in this. As we found in the earlier Lust pilot, there's limited opportunity to have these collaborative dialogues around land use, and that's a vital platform that can be provided. In terms of will it have decision making at the end of this? Well, certainly in terms of the Land Commission's recommendations, there was a recommendation that they should have some powers over targeting of regional budgets, but that's not been taken forward with the pilot process. But whether that ultimately will be what the government decides, well, it's an unknown. But I would hope so, because it gives strength to it, and I think it will bring more people to the table. So if they're going to function effectively, I think they would have to have some say over that. But it's obviously in the hands of the government to decide that.
Cool. I've got lots of questions I would ask, but there's a couple of questions coming in. I think I might just try and pick you for one or two more questions now, Andy, and then we'll jump on and we will answer all of the questions, even if we have to come back to them afterwards. So natural capital, I'm sure this will come up a couple of times in the event tonight. Natural capital is not an unproblematic concept. Are you inviting and or carrying out any critique of the phrase natural capital, the use of the term natural capital?
No, I mean, I appreciate that in many things we can be jargon heavy, and there's been a sort of change of emphasis, if you like, in terms of certainly in terms of biodiversity conservation, and a focus more on ecosystem function and restoration, and even from the phase of the earlier land use strategy pilot, we were talking about ecosystem services, an ecosystem approach, and now that's morphed into a natural capital approach. So it does bring connotations about valuation. And not everyone's entirely comfortable with that. I think part of our exercise is to introduce that concept, or raise awareness of that concept, and have a discussion about that concept. So accepting that there's a variety of views, and take that on board, but within the place where this is what the government is looking at, and it's not just in Scotland, it's across the UK, it's around the world really now. There's a strong focus on natural capital. Personally, I don't have a problem with it. It's at the end of the day, I think in many ways we rebrand many things, but we've got to try and achieve a balanced approach to land use to deliver those range of services that society needs. So yes, I understand that there's probably more explanation that is required, and certainly more than I can give you tonight. And it's something that we will be discussing with stakeholders as we go forward.
Cool. Brilliant. Can I just take a time just to ask one more question now, and then I'll leave something just to brew throughout the other presentations. Andy, this place-based approach, there's a lot of discussion about place-based approach at the moment. Have you refined that down to a snappy definition, or how would you introduce the place-based approach? The question is coming, what is meant by a place-based approach?
Okay. Well, again, we always draw on earlier experiences. When we worked on the land use strategy pilot, we worked at a focus on subcatchment areas. We felt we wanted to make sure we captured the broad range of land uses across the Borders region, and we felt that working within subcatchment areas had more resonance with local communities and local stakeholders, and it is that sense of place where people had a sort of sense of belonging and understanding, and for many of the communities in regions like ours across the south of Scotland, it's intergenerational. People have lived in these areas for a long time. So we think a flavour around local landscape areas is something that we can use for this pilot. With all things, we're going to be constrained as to how far we can go with resources that are available.
Because I Andy, have taken to mean to place-based approach, meaning you pick the place and you look at all services in that place rather than coming at it from a different sector or service angle. Is that right? You focus on the whether that is south of Scotland, rather than saying the statutory bodies in Scotland that have an interest in there. It's sort of everything that affects south of Scotland. Is that a better definition of place-based approach?
Yeah. ultimately we have to scale this up to the region, to the South of Scotland region.
Yeah.
But in order to enable us to do that, we need to go and investigate and look at this in more detail within local places. So we're using constructs such as local landscape areas or potentially subcatchments, or for example areas like the Glen Kens as areas of place that we can go and explore this with those communities of interest and those communities of place.
Cool. I said I wasn't going to ask you one more question, but I'd now like to make a 180 decision on that one. The last question that came in, really a little bit like mine, how will the framework relate to actual planning, consenting and ministerial decisions? So is that tied into what you were saying before? Is it sort of, we'll have to see how it works initially, but there is a long-term ambition that it forms a part in that process? Or do you have a vision at this moment of how the framework can actually influence planning and ministerial decisions?
Well, again, I think there's an ambition for all those pilots and many of the stakeholders are keen to see them happen, that it would have a place in helping to target within regions, and therefore whatever comes forward in the schemes post 2024, we would hope it would have a role in that. But there's no guarantee at this stage. So I was related to before, probably the nearest equivalent we've got is something like a woodland strategy, which is kind of anomalous in a way because it sits under the statutory planning process. It's policy guidance on the statutory planning process. So it's produced by local authorities, but it's to guide the forestry grant scheme, which is the decision maker, and its oversight of that is through Scottish Forestry or Forestry Commission Scotland, as was before. So there is no current place for an entire land use strategy, and woodland strategies have been here for quite some time, and the woodland and forestry sector has been very much ahead of the game, and we're catching up with that. And I think there's been aspiration to that for over 20 years, and we're still working towards having a more integrated, broader sectoral interest approach to a land use strategy. So where it ends up sitting, I don't know. I mean, it needs to find its place. We certainly look at the relationship with the strategy planning process and NPF4 and regional spatial strategies that are going to emerge from that.
Thank you so much, Andy. That's really useful. It's not a case of creating a new level of decision making. Is not really the aim of it here. It's about bringing together the different partners involved and trying to make better decisions overall. And that was very good. Thank you. That was the almost Paxman-like questioning there. Thank you very much for that, Andy. If you wouldn't mind getting ready, Kate and Claire, I will seamlessly make the audience white hot in anticipation of your arrival. We have here the discussion is that land use is not just science and numbers, but it is actually quite an emotive subject. And I think in any event like this, it's quite good to try and capture the emotion connected to land use. Delighted that we've got Claire Pensack and Kate Foster giving us a wee snapshot of how they see land use has influenced them as artists and some ideas for how to see land use. To give a wee introduction, both Kate and Claire are based in the Scottish Borders, and Kate took part in the pilot land use strategy held in the Borders in 2013, working through an art project, Working the Tweed, which some of you will know. This experience raised questions for them as local residents as well as artists, and prompted them to do more work in collaboration to try and engage with land use in different ways. They are now connected to 2 ongoing projects involving communities and land use in southern Scotland. Working with the Galloway Glens, Kate's been working on a sub-project called Peat Cultures, which fed into the current Crichton Carbon Centre Peat and Connections project. And in the Borders, Claire's been working with Southern Uplands Partnership to develop a proposal for the current Connecting Threads project as part of this larger Destination Tweed project being led by Tweed Forum. And so the principle here is how different ways that we can see and different ways that we can think about land use change. And we'll have this, and then we'll jump back to the national perspective from Scottish Land Commission. So the floor, as they say, Kate and Claire, is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to come over to Galloway Glens and the Glen Kens from the Borders. It's really great to be here and see you all. We're here as artists, and we want to offer some ideas to help think about land use. How did we get involved in the land use pilot? As McNab said, this was part of the Working the Tweed, which was a year-long partnership project. And Claire Pensack was the creative director. And she helped the team come up with new ways of bringing different communities of Borders people together around the catchment. We've written these up in a couple of posts, and I'll put the links in the chat at the end of the talk. These are the current projects that we're involved with across southern Scotland that McNab mentioned in the introduction: Peak Cultures, Peak Connections, and also connecting River Cultures, Connecting Threads, which has a great handbook you can download. Again, I'll put that in the link. So what do we want to talk about? Offering some ideas to think about land use that come from the projects that we've worked on as a dancer and visual artist. And we thought about just 3 points that might be helpful this evening. One is mapping and engagement, essentially ways of bringing people together in their locality. The other one is scale, both thinking about time and place. And thirdly, words, languages and vocabulary. At this point, I'm very happy to be able to pass you on to Claire.
Lovely. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much again, as Kate said, for the invitation. So Working the Tweed was a project that explored the region through the idea of river culture. And we did this through a programme of public events and exhibitions and riverside meetings, which brought together river specialists together with artists. We were adapting the themes of the Tweed Catchment Management Plan to highlight different local initiatives and to think about the catchment as a place where both humans and wildlife thrive. So it was about involving people in the places they live and the landscapes that they care about. So through this project, we learned about, or we came kind of into contact with the Scottish Government Land Use Regional Strategy. It was being piloted in the Scottish Borders, as Andy said, by Scottish Borders Council and our partner organisation, or one of our partner organisations, with Working the Tweed Forum, was sort of 2013 to 15. And there was a parallel one up in Aberdeenshire. And this caught our attention because it seemed so forward thinking that Scotland had included sustainable land use as part of climate change action. And taking part in this pilot really left a strong impression on us and has fed into our work. Now, almost a decade later, there's even more reason to be concerned and to be involved. And that is why it continues to be kind of uppermost in our respective artworks. So there was a genuine desire from Tweed Forum to involve a wide range of local people. This was in the land use strategy pilot. But as local people ourselves and not coming from a land management background, it was hard to know how to enter into the conversation. So for us, the difficulty was in getting past the more technical language used in both the communications and in the public events. So there wasn't perhaps as many different kinds of voices being heard as perhaps would have been desirable. So we were interested in using our different artistic skills and kind of practices to explore how we might have conversations about land use in a less technical way. The land use pilot was being developed in the Borders through a very detailed kind of mapping process. And from the cultural perspective, we became really interested in what wasn't visible on the maps. Local words connected to land and rural practices, local festivals, people's direct experiences of places like favourite swimming holes or foraging and picnic spots. Things that are valued about place, but not mapped, or at least not mapped on these big maps, mapped in ourselves, in our own maps, but not kind of in a kind of public broad way. And we also really wanted to think about these things, place, from a wildlife perspective. People found this catchment map, which Kate drew, really fascinating. It spoke to people beyond words and it became a motif for the project. So wherever we took it, from agricultural shows to wildlife festivals, it was a real conversation opener and it drew out so many stories, all experiences that weren't being mapped. And also with the map, rather than perceiving the Scottish Borders as a series of small towns with very strong civic pride and rivalries stretching from reivers to rugby and common ridings, the catchment map offered a much more kind of collaborative, connected, and in the end, ecological story of the region. So it was offering a different narrative to the one that is more visible.
And one of the artists summed it up very well. Claire, I'm going to have to ask you to read this because I can't see this.
Oh, yeah, great. So Jules Horn was we had 4 lead artists. Jules Horn's a writer, and she was one of the lead artists. And she's written, the catchment map helped to spark imagination and curiosity. And people tend normally to see the river as just something going through our town. And so the map kind of gave them a different insight into that. So the map also became for us an engagement tool, a storytelling tool that we could use to prompt different kinds of conversations. So for example, at the end of the project, we brought a group of diverse people together from across the whole Tweed catchment to have a day-long conversation. We asked each person if they could bring with them an object that expressed something about their connection to or their hope for their local river. And they used these as a way of introducing themselves. These objects included a stick that had been chewed by a beaver, not from the south of Scotland, I hasten to add, although it would be lovely, an oar and a collection of vintage land drains. And we also asked people to bring an image of something that they thought was working on their local river and another image of something that they thought needed improving. And so as you can see from the slide, we mapped all these things. And again, this started to add different things to the map, and it drew out different themes and again, different values. So Kate, over to you.
A map typically gives a human perspective, perhaps at one point in time. And one of the things that you learn to do as an artist is to offer ideas how to take different scales into account, how to juggle scales of time and place. And through working the Tweed, I learned how with a microscope, an expert can look at the rings on a salmon scale and understand its biography. I was shown how, with the orange picture, this salmon lived for 2 winters in the river, with a further winter at sea before returning to the Tweed to spawn. But over time, patterns are changing as migratory fish change their habits in warming waters. And you need to think in terms of the whole North Atlantic to appreciate the presence of salmon in Scottish rivers.
So language and vocabulary are also very much part of cultural heritage. And this slide is showing collections of words by other artists that they've collected together in both Scots and in Gaelic. And in the background, you can see pool names from the Tweed that we collected for working the Tweed project. So old words and place names can point back to the ways that people have worked the land and also reveal something about the diversity of species that they lived amongst. So these words not only offer a different kind of mapping of place and remind us of perhaps of some of the connections to land that have been lost over time, but it can also point towards future ways of living. So working creatively helps you to step into a place differently, to see it differently, to smell and taste it and hear it differently. And each art form can bring different kinds of knowledge to the fore. So in the case of dance or movement, this is knowledge coming from the body and it's an attention to movement. And on the slide, what you can see is what I would call a movement score. So it's a collection of words that I divide, well, the score I devised, but it's a collection of words to bring a more playful way to think about, in this case, it was a riverside habitat. And so here the riverside is conceived as an action space, and the idea of land use becomes something that's lively and improvised and something you can be part of. It also suggests ways of relating to a place that are shared with other creatures, and so it positions us as humans amongst them and not separate from them.
So why do we think it's important to find creative ways to think about land use? It helps us, we think, to sum up, find ways to relate to connect with, and to care for local places. Ways of mapping and of engaging people can be infused with curiosity, and they can also celebrate place. These are intangible values, things really beyond monetary value. Say you think about your locality in terms of action spaces for humans and non-humans, it can create a feeling of wonder. And looking at small details like a salmon scale or a stonefly that you saw in one of the pictures helps us think in much longer timescales and stretch ideas to a wider scale. Knowledge of place names and older words for things can be brought into focus. Artists are part of every community and can help carve out space for poetic observation that helps us face realities. We desperately need to engage differently with how people use and think about land. So a land use strategy has to become an opportunity to rethink how we live and dwell in places. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Claire and Kate. That was just lovely. There was and you didn't use an acronym at any point, which I hope that wasn't a mistake, but maybe you could read something quite heavily into that, possibly about the lack of acronym use in your take of land use. And maybe that's something we could feed into the broader discussion, is that if you just use words, then maybe you end up with different things being said. So really appreciate that, Claire and Kate. And it's interesting to keep that in mind, to have the counterpoint almost to the science and the scale. So next up, delighted to welcome Andrew Thin, and behind the scenes, Andrew's actually very gamely stepped in here to cover one of his colleagues who's got COVID. So it's Hamish, who Chief Executive of Scottish Land Commission, managed to effectively delegate upwards on this, and we now have the Chairman of the Scottish Land Commission covering Hamish. And I think what we're really interested to hear here is sometimes in Galloway it feels that it's just happening here, it's just us. And I think it would be quite nice to hear about what the role of Scottish Land Commission is, and maybe a bit more of the national perspective, tying it back to Galloway. So if you're happy, Andrew, I can see your screen. Looks brilliant.
No, thanks very much indeed. And I think the share screen function is working, so that's wonderful. Great. So yes, so I'm from the Scottish Land Commission, and I will be fairly brief because I do think these sorts of things work better when we're interacting with your questions and your priorities. Land Commission, just not everyone's even heard of this, but so we were established by the Land Reform Act in 2016, and our job is to provide advice and recommendations on land reform issues. And we do that, and every single piece of advice that we give is published. So there's no sense, there's sort of secret advice going to government or any nonsense like that. It's all published, and there's a vast amount of it already. We are a national organisation, so we're advising about national issues and from a national perspective. And there's no agenda, there's no dogma or political bias or anything in this. Our job is to provide advice on how Scotland could make more of its land for the benefit of the Scottish people, all the Scottish people. So it's very clear that it's not just the benefit of the few, it's the benefit of everyone. We are pretty small, there's only 12 staff, so we have to prioritise. And we're doing that, and we're working through a sort of series of priorities over time. I just want to be clear what land reform is, because it's different things to different people. I think most people know that land reform is something to do with huge land holdings, and the fact that Scotland has this very, very concentrated pattern of land ownership, the most concentrated in Western Europe, by which I mean that very few people own a very large proportion of Scotland's land. And most people also know that it's got something to do with the relationship between landlords and tenants, or landlords and crofters, and every so often there's further legislation to try and rebalance that and make it fair to all. But possibly fewer people know that it is now increasingly about things like carbon sequestration. And well, we've heard about natural capital. That can mean just about anything to anybody. But carbon sequestration is pretty clear, and the whole business of Scotland has huge potential to sequester carbon in its land, and that is increasingly a land reform issue. Vacant and derelict land is a massive issue for certain parts of Scotland, not least. I might mention Stranraer, but all over Scotland, particularly the more urban places, we've got huge chunks of vacant and derelict land and building that's going to waste. Land use planning you heard about from Andy, it's actually not that easy, because different people want different things. But how do we make sure that we plan the use of our land so that we're all happy with it? Responsible access has been much talked about, and Scotland now almost leads the world on responsible access rights to land. They also apply to water, of course, and that's perhaps slightly more difficult. Community ownership is much talked about, and most people think about communities, way up in the northwest owning chunks of land or islands like Egg or whatever. But community ownership is also about buildings, and there's communities owning. There's two that I can think of own cinemas. They own public toilets. There's even a community that owns a bridge. Increasingly, people are asking us to look at different ways of diversifying ownership and tenure in Scotland, partly because of the concentrated issue, but also partly because there's lots and lots of ordinary people who just want a wee bit of land. We did actually, after the First and Second World War, examine this pretty carefully, and we've sort of forgotten that. But the hutting movement, that's my granny's hut, that picture. But the hutting movement grew out of land reform, and it was an interesting idea where people could build huts on land that belonged to somebody else. It wasn't a particularly foolproof model, and actually the landlord, in the instance of my granny's hut, burnt her hut to the ground, so it didn't work entirely well. And then lastly, land reform is also about tax and financial support. Huge tax breaks available to people who own land for very good reason, but we have to recognise that if we give people tax breaks, we should expect something in return. And similarly, we provide large chunks of financial support to people who own land, and we should be clear about that. So land reform is not a new idea. We've been doing it for centuries, actually, and we should. We should continue to reform legislation, policy, and all the rest of it, because society evolves, and therefore our approach to land evolves. So we should continue to do it, but it's very easy to get it wrong and do stupid things. So quite challenging. There's a fundamental concept that underpins land reform in Scotland now, and I think it's worth just being clear. And it was spelt out in legislation in 2016. And it is this, that if you own and exercise rights in land, whatever that right might be, the right to grow something, a crop, the right to graze it, the right to plant trees, the right to block up drains and sequester carbon, the right to catch fish, to shoot deer, the right of access. With those rights goes responsibilities, and they are not separable. They are absolutely inseparable. With land rights go responsibilities. It's a fundamental concept and a really useful one. So let's try and just quickly relate this to Galloway. So land use change in Galloway. So I think there's 4 issues that we really need to focus on. Who has the power to decide what land use happens? Where does that power reside? Secondly, how does society, through organized regulatory processes, how does society control how land is used? Thirdly, how does society incentivize how land is used, either through government intervention or private? You know, there are plenty of private interventions in land use as well. And fourthly, and I think this is becoming more and more important, how do ordinary people at a local level engage in and influence land use decision making at a local level? And I think that's going to become much more important in the years to come, as we move from a more top-down national approach to a more localized approach. So the ownership issue, who decides? Clearly a big issue in Scotland because land ownership is so concentrated. If 400 people own over half of Scotland, then, and they do, then clearly those people, many of those people are in effect exercising localized monopolies over land use decision making. And that is a big issue, and we've published a lot of work on it already. And the Minister, in fact, will be announcing a consultation on a new land reform bill on Monday of next week to try and address or partially address this issue. Secondly, land markets and therefore land ownership is changing very fast. Just published a report on that as well. We are moving really quite quickly from a situation where most land was owned by individuals only, a decade or so ago, to a situation where a lot more land is owned by corporate entities of one kind or another, including insurance companies, including even Brewdog. And they own it for very different reasons, and their land use decision making is for very different reasons. Thirdly, what about the right of tenants to decide? So yes, the rights of tenants are a key issue, and I do think, looking forward, this whole concept of with land rights go responsibility is going to become much more important. Now, this is where something goes wrong. There we go. So regulatory. So we have a statutory planning system. We all know that if you're going to build a house, you've got to get planning consent. So that's there. It's democratically accountable at a reasonably local level, and it's certainly determines land use up to a point. Secondly, we're now piloting land use partnerships, as you just heard, and they will, I think, be given, we've certainly said they need to be given some teeth. I don't know exactly what that will look like, but there's no question that is going to be an important way forward. Thirdly, and particularly relevant to Galloway, the whole question of how do we decide on tree planting is a big issue in Galloway and elsewhere, Dumfries and the Borders and so on. Forestry, the Forestry Scotland is the body, and in effect, Forestry of Scotland controls that, because it controls where money goes, and very few people will plant many trees without public subsidy. And there is a process, quite a rigorous process around that, but a lot of people don't think it's working that well. Fourthly, we have a system in Scotland of statutory consultees. So the local authority, for example, will have by legal right, the right to be consulted on certain types of development. And I think, fifthly, possibly the most important one going forward, is that I think increasingly we are going to expect our democratically elected representatives to take more active interest in land use decision making, and to express that interest through, whether it's community council, whether it's local authority, or whether it's parliament. I think we're going to see more of that. The financial intervention, so clearly the way in which we deploy grants and subsidies has a huge influence over land use and land use change. Forestry is the most obvious. We've decided to spend a lot of money on planting trees to try and deal with carbon sequestration. But I think there's going to be a whole load of change around agricultural subsidies as well. And I also think, to some extent, private money is going to come in to influence land use. You're seeing it already with big, wealthy charities, often from the south, coming in and buying land with a view to rewilding it using private money. Taxation, we've published advice on taxation. We think there's more we could do. Scotland, a lot of taxation powers are reserved to Westminster, so it's not easy, but we think there's more you could do. And we also think that there's more you could do with cross-compliance. And what cross-compliance means is that if you're going to get public money for doing X, then you also need to be doing Y. And if you're not doing Y, you won't get public money for doing X. And lastly, this whole question of engagement and consultation. The Land Reform Act 2016 was absolutely clear. There's a whole section making it absolutely clear that Parliament expects communities to be properly engaged in decisions, any significant decision relating to land use. And they linked it very explicitly. Again, Parliament was absolutely clear. They linked it to human rights obligations on the Scottish Government, both the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the one that entrenches property rights, but they also, and I think this is really important, they also linked it to the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And therefore they were saying, in effect, yes, property rights are a human right. You know, the right to enjoy your property peacefully is a human right, but that's not an absolute right. That needs to be modified by the rights of other people, social, cultural, or whatever. So we've published a protocol on community engagement in decisions relating to land, and that sets out what communities should expect, what landowners should expect, and it's really important that that's followed. I think looking forward, there's probably these four things that are worth really thinking about. There's no question in my mind that you're going to see government strengthening this land rights and responsibilities idea. If you want to exercise land rights, if you own land rights and you want to exercise them, you must behave responsibly. And they're going to increasingly spell out what responsible looks like. So I think that demand is going to be there. I attended the Scottish Land and Estates annual conference the other day, and speaker after speaker stood up and said, I recognise that we now have responsibilities as well as rights. So the world is moving. Secondly, there will be a further land reform bill in 2023. Consultation on that will be launched next week by the Minister. Please engage in that consultation. It's going to be a very important piece of legislation. The Land Use Partnerships pilot you've heard about, please make sure you're engaged in that. It's hugely important. And we will be publishing our next set of priorities for 2023 in 2023, and we run monthly public meetings. Please get involved in them to talk to people, listen to people, and figure out what should be in there. But there is also now this new hub, and I think it's really useful because it's a way of different bits of Scotland sharing their experience. So myland.scot, you Google it if you're not sure, is a place where you can learn a lot more. One of the things it does is there's a wonderful wee podcast, and we had Darren McGarvey on it, and he's a really powerful speaker, so I just flagged that, but there are plenty others too. And please contact us. So we have a website, there it is. There's a wealth of stuff. If you suffer from insomnia, it's a gift. It's just, there's so much stuff there. But also, if you want to talk to us, please get in touch with us. And if you want to talk to me and you email that email address and tell me you want to talk to me, I'll phone you. Perfectly happy to do that. You know, we're a wee outfit, so it's quite easy to do that. Thanks, McNab. I hope you've managed to hear all that.
Brilliant. No, there was a moment of audio trouble in the middle there, but I'm so glad we stuck with it. My goodness, Andrew, that resonated with me. There was an awful lot. You've done a very good whistle stop tour there, but there are so many points you just touched upon that, from my perception, align with what's going on in Galloway at the moment. There's a couple of reports you mentioned. You mentioned a report on land ownership that's recently been published. Would you be able to, after this, if you could pop that maybe into the chat? I think a couple of people will be interested in that. And also monthly public meetings and things. Questions come up about link to the podcast as well. It was absolutely fascinating. If I could ask one question, and I'm so sorry, I know we're running out of time, but one question: how does Galloway feature on your desk in terms of activity, concerns, engagement, simple amount of land that's changing hands? Is Galloway a national story in terms of what's going on here in Southwest?
Yeah, I think Galloway's a national story on two fronts at the moment, and it changes, of course. But I mean, first of all, there is no question whatsoever that the shift from sheep to forestry across Galloway in particular, is absolutely on our radar. And I've been down to Galloway several times. I also actually walked the Southern Upland Way because it's one of the best ways of seeing some of this thing on the ground. So you just need to go there and look. You can see the extraordinary change. So that's point one. Point two, I would say, the other thing that's really visible in Galloway is the potential, and I think it's serious potential, for Scotland to make money and attract investment as a place to where carbon can be sequestered, particularly in the way we manage peatland. A lot of peatland in Galloway. A lot of great work actually been done in Dumfries on how we do that. And I see, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think Scotland will, one way or the other, make a great deal of money over the next 50 to 100 years by sequestering carbon into its peatlands, by managing peatland in a different way and sequestering carbon. The big challenge, and we've just published some work on this week, the big challenge is how do you make sure that money and that benefit is shared fairly? And there's a high risk that benefit will stick to very few fingers, and we need to try and address that.
That's absolutely fascinating, Andrew. I know there'll be questions when we come to the end as well, because that's it's so interesting to know how Galloway's been seen on the national stage, because that's almost quite heartening in a way, because you start to think it's just us shouting into the void, but it's good to know that it is featuring on the national stage. Very interesting to hear more about Scottish Land Commission. And now, we've just to bring a slightly more local element, I'd like to hand over to Ed Forrest. Many of you know Ed Forrest as director of the Galloway Southern Ayrshire UNESCO Biosphere, the first biosphere in Scotland, it should be stressed. And Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership is delighted to be a sort of biosphere in action in a way, is because part of the reason we got the money is because of the biosphere designation, and we're one of the 7 river catchments. But I think it'd be really interesting, having heard the national perspective, to hear from Ed, both within the biosphere, but I'd like to maybe touch upon with a question about the international network, possibly, and learnings we can have from abroad when it comes to land use change. I think would be very interesting. If you're happy, Ed, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks for that introduction, McNab, and thank you very much for inviting me to come along this evening. Some really good presentations so far, with some things that certainly resonate with us here in the biosphere that have been talked about already, and so hopefully we can just build on that as we go forward. So our UNESCO Biosphere designation is basically it's international recognition of the landscapes, the wildlife, the culture, the people who live and work and have a commitment to sustainability in Southwest Scotland. We cover 5,268 square kilometres of Scotland, and we're based on river catchments. So looking at the primary rivers that run out of the Galloway Hills and our connection with that water roundabout. That means that we cover 3 local authority areas and have in effect actually created a new geography, not least since traditionally Dumfries and Galloway has tended to work with the Scottish borders, and the Ayrshire elements of the biosphere have traditionally tended to look more to the north and the Clyde. At the very heart of our biosphere, we have a series of core areas which are of high nature conservation value, and they include Ken's Moorfleet National Nature Reserve, Merrick Kells, which is both a special area of conservation, but also one of only 2 designated wildland areas in the south of Scotland, and Silverflow Ramsar, which is one of the most important biosystems in both the UK and indeed in Europe. The buffer of the biosphere is largely based on Galloway Forest Park and is an area that supports sustainable timber production, tourism opportunities, and is intended to create ecological connectivity through the buffer and onto the core area of the biosphere. The transition area then is the outer area around that, which is where the vast majority of us live and work, and our focus within that area is very much on sustainable development. So the biosphere is managed by a partnership board, and that partnership board comprises a mix of public, private and third sector representatives. The third sector representatives come from environmental NGOs and local communities. And indeed, it's the only such grouping in Southwest Scotland where you have such a diverse mix of people coming together to talk about sustainability issues within the region. In addition, we also work with a wide range of other partners on a variety of projects, research initiatives and funding bids that together help us to fulfil the UNESCO Biosphere mandate. And as McNab's already said, Galloway Glens is one of the key things that we've been involved in. We also work with a large landscape partnership scheme in East Ayrshire called the Coalfield Environment Landscape Partnership, Coalfield Communities Landscape Partnership, and a whole range of other partners, many of whom I'm sure are on the call tonight as well. The underlying focus for the biosphere is very much on sustainable development. So for us, that sustainable development is looking at how the biosphere can benefit the local economy, how it can benefit local society and local communities, and indeed how it can benefit the local environment. And so we have 3 key areas of work that are focused on trying to help us achieve that. We have a business development scheme team who support local businesses to see the value of the natural environment and the different benefits that they can bring to local communities, and how by working together they can actually be part of something bigger by those businesses networking and seeing the added value they can bring. We have a community education program that is focused on the social side, that is about engagement with local communities and schools. So that includes initiatives like our Biosphere Footsteps program, which is focusing on carbon literacy and some of the small changes that individuals can make to reduce the carbon footprints or improve the sustainability of their own lives, but indeed their wider community that they live in. And I have to acknowledge Galloway Glens here because we shamelessly stole elements of Biosphere Footsteps from McNab in developing this program, but it's a program that's really useful and goes down really well across the whole of the biosphere area. We are also involved in education for sustainability, where we're supporting schools in using the biosphere as a focus for learning and education. And then we have an environment team. And our environment team is focused on land use and biodiversity, and they're supporting the development and the delivery of initiatives that assist land managers in achieving the delivery of wider environmental benefits, such as biodiversity enhancement, water regulation, carbon sequestration, is very much the focus that we're looking at there. But really, the biosphere is only delivering well for us when all 3 of those aspects are in harmony. We need to have a healthy local economy that supports and enables local people to continue living, working, bringing up families in our communities. And we need to have an environment that will provide for us both today and on into the future. And it's on the back of that that we got involved in a project with colleagues at Edinburgh University and Forest Research. And this was looking at the pressures of land use, which have been a feature of biosphere discussions ever since we were designated 10 years ago. And over that 10-year period, as a biosphere, we've contributed quite widely to consultations on local and national policy that are related to land use. We've facilitated discussions with different stakeholder groups to identify some of the challenges they face. And so the opportunity to get involved in this project seemed to us to tick many of the boxes of the issues that we felt were being faced in Southwest Scotland. So that project brought together a wide range of stakeholders, both local and national, to discuss a vision for future land use in the biosphere. And the participants that were involved recognised that the current approaches of intensive and often binary land use that was focused on very singular outcomes, either through dairy farming, forestry, wasn't necessarily working for everyone. And that what was required was a much more integrated approach that actively included local people, local communities in identifying their needs, their priorities, alongside those of land managers and investors in land. So that vision was advocating a much more diverse approach to woodland structures, for instance, that were good for biodiversity, were good for recreation, good for landscape, as well as also offering economic potential through the timber production. They were advocating the restoration of degraded habitats, such as peatlands, more diverse approaches to farming that supported a wider variety of local food production, sustainable tourism opportunities that celebrated our local environments and our local culture, and looking at opportunities that would bring direct benefits to our local communities, that would help to create the development of new sustainable employment opportunities that would either retain or indeed attract other people to the area. And that project worked really well, particularly when we were working on the macro scale, looking at the biosphere as a whole. I have to say, it became a lot more challenging as we began to zoom in on more defined areas, and where it was actually looking or trying to look at specific areas of land. But I think what was really positive from that was this shared vision that involved a very broad cross-section of stakeholders, both from industry and from policy and local representation at the same time. And really what that demonstrates for us is that the biosphere's vision is about demonstrating a passion for living in a way that benefits people and nature. And for us, it really is, it's about that relationship between people. We think that people have to be an integral part of the conversation. If we don't involve local people in what we're discussing, then the biosphere really can't achieve its full aspirations.
Thanks so much for that, Ed. That was really good to get. I mean, like I say, the first biosphere in Scotland, right in our doorstep. It's a question of how we can use that designation to help us tackle these challenges that we're facing. There's a bit of chat in the chat box, Ed, without having a long discussion about biosphere boundaries. But there's a question about Stranraer, and wouldn't it be nice if Stranraer was included in the biosphere? I don't know if you want to say a couple of words about.
It would be lovely if it was included in the biosphere, and indeed we've done quite a lot of work, McNab, with Solwayford Partnership actually led on some public consultation for us, looking at the Rins of Galloway and Stranraer, and there was unanimous support for the fact that the biosphere should be reviewing its boundaries and looking to try and bring that in. And there will be a recommendation going to UNESCO later this year. We hope to have the answer to that recommendation in the early summer of next year, as to whether or not it's been successful.
Cool. So watch this space. Watch this space for the Rins.
Yeah, absolutely. Here first.
Yeah, and just to ask, I know we're about to open it up for broader discussion, but if I could abuse my position just again to ask one more question, Ed, is that the challenges we're facing regarding land use in Galloway, that feels like there's a lot going on at the moment. It's all happening very quickly without proper sort of almost attention being given to the subject. And I'm very interested in this international network of biospheres. And I suppose that the challenge is that you don't just share what's going brilliantly within different biospheres, and whether there's an opportunity for us to learn from other biospheres about how challenges over land use are being discussed. I don't know. Does that ever come up in discussion?
Absolutely, it does, McNab. I mean, we're slightly different in the UK in that I guess our landscape tends to be much more of a cultural landscape, as Andy highlighted at the beginning, whilst in other parts of Europe where protected areas tend to be much more about being protected for nature very often. However, you know, our colleagues in other biospheres do have similar challenges on land use. Certainly from conversations with them, it's perhaps currently less about afforestation that comes up with us, and more about some of the pressure for renewables in some of those areas, which ends up being quite a common theme. But we do know that other biospheres within the UK have got similar issues. We've got colleagues in Wales who have similar sort of challenges and pressures that they're trying to.
That's fascinating. Okay, it's so much easier to share what's going well than it is than challenges being faced. And I think sometimes in Galloway we can feel slightly this is just happening to us, and so it's opportunity to use that network really. Right, so we've got the panel here. I don't know if you're happy to close Ed down slightly. He's quite a strong projection on my screen. Well, I'm happy with that. If Ed is, that's brilliant. If we can go to the questions. Right, we've got 3 questions here. Repurposing of old, abandoned, or alternative farm use buildings on land could be a pathway for smallholders to contribute to the future of land use, land management, and food security. How can people wanting to buy or lease a small holding from a large farm or landowner create opportunities for alternative futures? I suppose I'm tempted to ask you, Andrew, whether you picked up on this on the national stage or this has happened elsewhere, the idea of maybe not the breaking up of large portions of land, but maybe the engagement with smaller pieces of larger land holdings, and whether that helps create opportunities.
Well, first of all, diversification of land ownership is a Scottish Government priority. So breaking up, maybe that's a harsh word, but there's no question that it is recognised that, you know, where you've got highly concentrated, you know, big holdings, there is merit in fragmenting them to some extent, but you have to be careful because clearly there are some benefits from economies of scale and so on and so forth. I'm absolutely clear that we're going to have to get much better at models of tenure or models of governance that don't necessarily, we take this very simplistic view in this country that you either own it or you don't. In other parts of Europe, you'll have multi-layered ownership structures where different people will own different rights in the same piece of land. You know, some people will own the rights to the trees, others will own the grazing rights, someone else will own the fishing rights or whatever. And you'll have a sort of more complex governance structure to enable that to happen. That needs to happen in Scotland. We're going to do some work on that very soon. In fact, we've started on it. So I'm not going to preempt you because I don't know exactly what we're going to recommend yet, but we will be doing that. But there are, people forget that that's actually what crofting is. Crofting, you have a landowner and then you have tenants, and the tenants get together and actually cooperate on common grazing. So there's already a bit of a model there. And I think there are also incentives, the small holdings legislation in this country as well, which is a very old piece of legislation, which does allow the creation of small holdings, again, as small tenanted holdings. The problem with crofting tenure is simply that at the moment it's restricted to what are called the crofting counties, but there is the option of extending the crofting counties and bringing crofting tenure into play in other areas. So I think there's everything to play for, and I absolutely agree with the implication behind the question, which is that if energetic young people could get hold of small bits of land, they could do great things.
Andrew, thank you for answering that so frankly as well. Just while we have you, Andrew, do you know any good examples of community-owned farms, and do you think it would work for the Glen Kens? Do any names come to mind, or if you want to think on it, you could throw them into the chat, but I don't know whether any come to mind as
Well, I mean, for example, Gear, the whole island is owned by the community, and there's a farm. So that would be one, but there are many, actually. There are a great many. What almost always happens, however, is that while the community owns the farm, they then have some arrangement. It could be a tenancy, it could be a contract farming arrangement, or it could be a share farming arrangement. They almost always have an arrangement with a farmer who runs it as their farm, so to speak. The idea of, I actually worked, I'm old enough to have worked on a kibbutz in the period after the Yom Kippur War in the late 70s. And so I know what collective farming looks like. I'm not convinced that collective farming would work that well in Scotland, but I am convinced that community control of land and communities deciding how farms are run and so on absolutely does work and could be extended.
Cool. Thanks so much for that, Andrew. Ed, just while you're here, can I throw this at you from Helen Kerrin? Some of you know Helen Kerrin used to work at Galloway Glens scheme and was the originator of the Galloway Footsteps initiative, which you credited me for very kindly a minute ago. You said, Ed, you said it got harder as you zoomed in closer on the project you were working on. And the question is, what role do you see the biosphere taking on a more granular land use work like this? Or is this something that you feel able to tackle on a sort of more local basis?
One of the key aspirations of the biosphere, and one of the things that we have been developing is a land use team. And we see that land use team as being able to actively go out and work with individual land managers and helping them to identify and realise a wider range of benefits from the way that land is managed. And that is one of the reasons why we're part of the Borderlands project that is focused on natural capital. And Andy talked quite extensively earlier about natural capital, and we're looking at how we can work in partnership with colleagues from SAC to look at doing Scottish agricultural consultants to look at how we can do natural capital audits of individual holdings and look at putting forward programs of recommendations. In the fullness of time, we would also like to be able to extend some of that to looking at how we can better support communities in looking at some of the land use change that is going on in their area. But as you'll be aware, our team is still very new in post. They're still finding their feet in that respect. And we have a number of these initiatives that are coming on stream towards the end of this.
All focusing on the more local, I can see that absolutely must be much harder working on that, but I suppose that's where the results are. There's a lot of excellent questions. I was scrolling down through, so I might call upon my charming assistant to flag up any that I'm in danger of missing, but Andrew, you've been startlingly frank about the challenges facing Scottish land and land reform. The question that's come in here, answer this as you wish, but is there a current black market on land sales and especially segmentation of large landholders? Do you feel that the land sale process is working fairly at the moment? I suppose is that the gist of the question.
So the answer, the answer to the second part of your question is no. I don't think it is working fairly. I think black market's probably I'm not sure it's a helpful term because there's different meanings to different people. Reminds people of sort of flogging off rations during the war and stuff. There is an off-market, a lot of off-market sales. In other words, land that is sold and nobody ever knows it's being sold. And we just published a report last week. Please read it. I think I put the link up, but I'll check. We published a report last week, and one of the things we have recommended is that it should be mandatory for sales of land to be advertised.
And that addresses the separate point about sort of secrecy and knowledge and things. Are you able to say anything, Andrew, about the digitization of land ownership or land registry in Scotland? I can't remember where that's got to now. Is that public bodies are now publicly available?
Yeah, so it's not complete yet. It's a huge job. Good progress is being made, but it's, everybody wants things to happen faster than they can. That's life. I think we have to accept that it is a huge job. It's moving forward as fast as possible. It is not yet complete. There are all sorts of bits of land and property all over Scotland that we just haven't got in yet. But Scottish Government absolutely has that on its radar, and we already have, the bulk of stuff is on it.
Cool. A comment here from Andy, a brilliant comment with a link there about how to keep in touch with our developments. So information updates on the regional land use partnership pilots can be found, and there's a link there. So do make a point of bookmarking that. Do throw any other questions in. If I could just refer on my laser display board to the results of the polls that we've had. So do you know what just transition means? We've got 28% say yes, 53% say no, and 19% not sure. So, oh, look at that, seamlessly, it's appeared on the screen in front of me. I'm trying not to call upon you for everything, Andrew, so I'm actually better actually to have Andy's thoughts on this. Andy, would you be able to say anything about how you see just transition, or would you be able to, you must get asked, I don't know if you've refined a response to the definition of a just transition when it comes to land use, I don't know. Are you glad I asked you that question?
Yeah, probably not quite refine my answer to it, but I'll try and answer it. Thanks, McNab. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's fundamental in terms of what we want to try and achieve with the regional land use partnership, and it obviously feeds into that bigger program of the just transition. So, I guess fundamentally is that to achieve those climate change objectives is going to require quite radical changes in the way that we structure our economy. And for older people like me who can remember the times at the end of the 70s, early 80s, where there was a radical shake of our economy and what could be described easily as an unjust transition, the ending of many heavy industries and the impacts on communities there. So the Scottish Government's objective is to acknowledge that there will be change as we move towards a more green and sustainable economy. And in doing so, we need to make sure that the businesses and communities are brought along with that, and the impacts that may arise are addressed and mitigated. So it's a fair way that this is achieved fundamentally.
Yeah, and I suppose the fundamental challenge there is of a just transition is it goes against our scorecard on how humanity has managed that in the past, probably, doesn't it? It's probably the challenge. We're looking for a change of how these things have happened through history, is to try and challenge that and say, with this change happening, let's try and do this in a just and fair, equitable way is probably the challenge of it. It doesn't seem to be our form. And then looking at another question here, do you feel you can proactively engage with local and regional discussions and consultations? 23% of attendees say yes, 43% say no, and 33% not sure. So obviously about a quarter of people say they currently feel able to engage. And I think that's probably very interesting to take back on a number of levels as we talk about consultation and this engagement. And there was a very good comment made about how education is a key. Community education on how we engage with these points is made, and I think that probably feeds into, I know, work Andrew mentioned Scottish Land Commission doing in terms of education and community engagement, but it's all about it probably cuts across a number of sectors. Do you want to say anything about that, Andrew? Does that surprise you that only a quarter of people feel able to engage in this discussions around land use change?
No, it doesn't surprise me, and I think we absolutely have to do more work on this. So part of the problem is that the landowners are not engaging with communities, and you know, to be fair, that's not because they're nasty people. Most landowners are just like everybody else. You know, 95% of all people are good people. The problem is that a lot of landowners are frightened of engaging with communities. They don't have the confidence. And similarly, a lot of communities are frightened of engaging with landowners. So there's a gulf, and we've got to bridge that, which is why we've published the protocol. I put it up in the chat to try and help people. So, you know, I strongly recommend get that protocol, print it off, get a few of you together and go along to the local landowner, bang on the door and say, can we work together to follow the script that the Scottish Land Commission have set out? And that will help to build the bridges that need built here.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Andrew. And the first question, I think we might have just been pioneering the poll format because we only had 6 responses. Have you noticed land use changing locally? 100% said yes. So it's interesting that it's certainly getting the cut through, although possibly that is a sample of people who've attended a land use event. So there's probably you can dilute that to an extent. Right, we're running pretty much bang on time here. I think just to wrap things up from my point of view, I just want to say a couple of words. Thank you so much to the presenters for taking part, providing the regional land use partnership angle and then broadening it out to almost the artistic interpretation of land use. Andrew providing a sort of national perspective and Scottish Land Commission, and Ed bringing that back to saying that designations such as the biosphere and what opportunities does that provide. And I think the point that comes clear is that I think everyone has said that this is a complex, not a simple solution subject, but I think that the more we can engage with these opportunities, I think is probably the best, that will provide the best outcome for all. So a massive thanks to everyone who spoke, massive thanks to everyone who's attended through the event and put questions into the questions and answers section, questions into the chat. Behind the scenes, very grateful to Morag Patterson, who's helped identify speakers and pull the event together. And I think one thing we'll be trying to do with Galloway Glens scheme over the next year or so is trying to build on maybe some of the connections we've made tonight and try to, anything we can do to raise the engagement levels or the understanding locally on this most complex of subjects, I think would be a benefit. So with that, I'd like to suggest we call the event to a close. And in our own way, we will thank you very much to everyone taking part and keep an eye on the Galloway Glens channel for any future events. Brilliant. Thank you all so much and good night.